Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Eclipsed Heir, an Honoring Audiobooks original story from the reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1, Shadows over Kensington. The thick fog of an early Victorian spring had settled heavy upon London, muffling the usual clamor of carriage wheels and hurried footsteps in the streets below. From the window of our modest rooms at 221B Baker Street, I watched the gas lamps flicker uncertainly through the damp haze, casting long, tremulous shadows that danced like phantoms against the brick facades. It was a night pregnant with anticipation, one the newspapers had been heralding for weeks, the night of a rare and total solar eclipse. Sherlock Holmes sat in his accustomed chair by the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his sharp, hawk-like nose, eyes closed in that peculiar manner he favored when turning over a problem in his mind. The flicker of flames illuminated the deep hollows of his cheeks and the dark, curling lock of hair falling over his brow. A thin pipe, never far from his hand, rested between his lips. I, John H. Watson, M.D., recently returned from active service in Afghanistan, and forever the eager chronicler of my friend's unparalleled talents, had found this evening's quiet before the storm to be an opportunity for reflection. Yet the peaceful ambiance was to be shattered shortly by an unexpected visitor, one whose arrival would draw us into a web of mystery and celestial intrigue far beyond the usual puzzles that so fascinated Holmes. A sharp knock at the door roused Holmes from his reverie. "Come in," he called without opening his eyes. The door swung open to reveal a man of imposing stature and grave demeanor. His coat was trimmed with sable, and the heavy velvet of his waistcoat bespoke considerable wealth. Yet the shadow beneath his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and mounting dread. "Dr. Watson? Mr. Holmes? I am Lord Ambrose Darlington," the man announced, his voice low but resonant. "I regret to intrude upon your evening, but I find myself in desperate need of your particular talents." Holmes rose with measured grace and extended a slender hand. "Lord Darlington, your reputation precedes you, though I confess this is the first occasion upon which we meet. Pray, be seated and tell us what ails you." The nobleman sank heavily into the armchair opposite the hearth, clasping his hands tightly together. "My son, Edmund, has vanished without a trace. It happened 3 nights ago, just before the eclipse. We fear he has been taken, but the circumstances are most peculiar." I leaned forward instinctively, the words "vanished" and "eclipse" combining to pique my curiosity immediately. Holmes motioned for Lord Darlington to continue. "Edmund is the sole heir to the Darlington estate," Lord Ambrose explained, his voice tinged with sorrow and urgency. "He is a scholar of astronomy, something of an eccentric for a man of his standing. His studies led him to the family's observatory on the grounds, an old stone tower built by my grandfather, equipped with telescopes and charts far beyond what most noble families possess." He paused, drawing a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket, and placed it carefully on Holmes's cluttered table. "This belonged to Edmund. It contains his observations and notes about the eclipse, celestial charts, and other matters more obscure." Holmes picked up the book with an almost reverential air, flipping through its pages filled with elegant handwriting, arcane symbols, and elaborate diagrams of the sun, moon, and stars. "Did he leave any indication as to why he might have disappeared?" I asked. "None that we can find. He was last seen at the observatory just before sunset, preparing for the eclipse. The servants heard no disturbances, but come morning, he was gone." His quarters were undisturbed. "The family is distraught, and whispers of ransom demands have been received, but the letters are crude and unsigned." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he examined the notebook, tracing his finger along a series of interconnected star maps. "You mentioned a ransom," Holmes said. "Have you informed the authorities?" Lord Darlington's face grew grim. "Yes, but I fear the police are ill-equipped to handle a matter so entwined with peculiarities. There are those in the household who believe Edmund's disappearance is no mere kidnapping, but rather something far more sinister, a curse, perhaps, tied to an ancient prophecy said to be linked with the eclipse." I glanced at Holmes, whose expression darkened with interest. "A curse," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "How delightfully theatrical." Lord Darlington gave a slight, bitter smile. "Indeed, but the Darlington family has long been plagued by strange superstitions. The eclipse was said to be an ill omen, and Edmund was said to have meddled with forbidden knowledge, astronomical and otherwise. Holmes stood abruptly and began to pace the room, eyes fixed on the notebook. "This eclipse," he said, "is our deadline. If the next total eclipse does not occur within the year, all hope of discovering Edmund's fate may be lost. There is a pattern here, a code hidden within these celestial charts and the timing of the disappearance. We must understand the science and the superstition alike." "Then you will help us, Mr. Holmes?" Lord Darlington implored. Holmes regarded him for a long moment before answering. "I take no cases lightly, my lord. Your son's life and your family's honor depend upon the resolution of this mystery. Watson and I will depart at dawn to the Darlington estate." I nodded eagerly. "And I will bring my medical bag. Should there be any physical harm, I will be ready." Lord Darlington bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you, gentlemen. Time is of the essence." As our guests departed into the misty London night, Holmes turned to me with a spark of his usual intensity. "Watson, this is no ordinary disappearance. The celestial mechanics at play, the ancient prophecy, and the forged will we have yet to uncover, these are threads of a tapestry woven with both science and shadow." I could only stare at him, both apprehensive and exhilarated by the challenge ahead. The game was afoot, and this time it would be written in the stars. The gas lamp flickered again as the door closed behind Lord Darlington, leaving Holmes and me alone in the thickening gloom. The clock on the mantel ticked audibly in the silence that followed, each second marking the inevitable approach of the eclipse and the shadowy enigma that surrounded it. Holmes did not immediately return the notebook to its resting place. Instead, he placed it reverently upon the table, spreading his long fingers wide as if to cradle it. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "This book is more than a mere log of celestial observations. It is a key, a cipher of knowledge, half scientific, half occult. Notice here." He pointed to a margin near a detailed chart of the moon's path across the sun. "This series of numbers and symbols. They are not standard astronomical notations." I leaned closer. "You mean like a code?" "Precisely. And the manner in which the symbols intersect with the eclipse path suggests a deliberate concealment of meaning. Our young Edmund was no simple amateur astronomer, but a man obsessed with secrets that may have cost him his liberty, or worse." I glanced around the cluttered room, noting Holmes's scattered papers, his battered violin resting against the wall, and the scent of pipe smoke that seemed to cling to every surface. Even amidst the chaos, Holmes's mind was a finely tuned instrument, ready to pick out the faintest discord. "Did Lord Darlington mention any enemies? Family disputes? Anyone who might benefit from Edmund's disappearance?" I inquired. Holmes shook his head. "Not explicitly. But the hint of a forged will is a shadow cast over the estate. Such things rarely come without motive." Just then, Mrs. Hudson, our ever-patient landlady, entered with a tray bearing hot tea and biscuits, her eyes curious but respectful. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," she said softly, placing the tray on the side table. "But I heard a great deal of talk downstairs about this eclipse and your visitor. If I may say so, Mr. Holmes, such things as eclipses always bring a kind of restless spirit to London." Holmes smiled faintly. "Your wisdom is noted, Mrs. Hudson. I dare say the restless spirits will find themselves quite busy over the coming weeks." She nodded and withdrew, leaving us to our thoughts. I settled into my chair, pondering the strange combination of astronomy, prophecy, and high society intrigue. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the unfolding of some cosmic drama. Holmes broke the silence. "Watson, prepare yourself for a journey beyond the familiar streets of London. We shall enter the world of the Darlington estate, where science and superstition collide beneath a sky darkened by the eclipse." I felt a thrill of anticipation mingled with unease. What mysteries awaited us in that ancient observatory, and what fate had befallen the eclipsed heir? Before I could ask, Holmes resumed his study of the notebook, the lines between the stars and the shadows beginning to blur in his keen mind. Chapter 2. Beneath the Shadowed Dome. The dawn that broke over London was pale and hesitant, a faint glimmer struggling through the omnipresent gray smog that clung to the city like a shroud. My preparations were swift. I packed my medical satchel with the usual instruments, lanterns, and notes, while Holmes, already alert and focused, scrutinized the Darlington notebook with a quiet intensity that betrayed his mounting excitement. By mid-morning, we were aboard a hired hansom cab bound for the West End, where the imposing Darlington estate lay nestled in the sprawling greenery of Kensington. The journey was brief, but filled with portent. Holmes, ever the observer, sat with his eyes flicking from the windows to his notebook, murmuring fragments of calculations and musings about the solar eclipse. I, meanwhile, felt the weight of anticipation settle upon me like a physical presence. The city slowly yielded to the countryside, and the haze began to thin, revealing the rolling lawns and stately trees that bordered the estate grounds. When we arrived, we were greeted by a somber procession. A butler with a stern visage, a housekeeper with eyes too tired for her years, and a few silent servants bustling behind. The house itself was an edifice of aged stone and Gothic embellishments, ivy crawling up its walls, its many windows staring blankly like watchful sentinels. The Darlington coat of arms, an eagle clutching a crescent moon, was prominently displayed above the great oak door. Holmes and I were ushered inside with an air of restrained urgency. The interior was richly appointed. Dark wood paneling, Persian carpets muted by decades of tread, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors glaring from their frames. Yet beneath the veneer of wealth there was a palpable tension, an unspoken fear that hung in the heavy air. We were soon introduced to Lady Eleanor Darlington, a woman of regal bearing, whose powdered hair was pulled tightly back in the latest fashion. Her face was lined with worry, but her eyes bore the fierce determination of one accustomed to bearing her family's burdens. She grasped my hand with surprising strength. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming so swiftly," she said. "My son's disappearance has shattered our household. I trust you will uncover what the police have failed to see." Holmes inclined his head politely. "We shall do our utmost, Lady Darlington. Your son's fate and the truth are what we seek." From the shadows of the grand staircase appeared a man with a rigid posture and sharp eyes, Lord Ambrose Darlington, whose earlier visit to Baker Street had already set the tone for the investigation. He greeted us again, his manner less formal now, but no less grave. "Let us begin," he said. "You will want to see Edmund's rooms and the observatory without delay." We were led through the vast corridors, the walls echoing faintly with our footsteps. Our first stop was Edmund's chambers, a room both scholarly and personal. Stacks of astronomical texts lay scattered upon a heavy desk, alongside quills, inkpots, and unfinished letters. The bed was unmade, a sign of his sudden departure. On the wall hung a large hand-drawn map of the stars, meticulously detailed and annotated with strange symbols. Holmes approached the map with reverence, his fingers tracing constellations as if seeking a hidden melody. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Note the alignment of these markings with the predicted path of the eclipse. But what do these symbols mean? Alchemical, perhaps? Or a cipher?" Lady Eleanor watched him intently. Edmund believed the eclipse was more than a celestial event. He spoke often of an ancient prophecy passed down through our family, one that foretold disaster should the eclipse coincide with a certain celestial alignment. "A prophecy?" I echoed. "Is there any record of this?" Lord Ambrose stepped forward. "Only fragments, Doctor. The Darlington family archives are vast, but many documents are cryptic or incomplete. Edmund was the only one to piece together parts of the legend which speaks of a shadow heir, a lost son who would vanish beneath the darkened sun, only to return when the stars align once more." Holmes's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "A shadow heir, a phrase pregnant with meaning. It suggests disappearance, substitution, perhaps even usurpation. The timing of Edmund's vanishing, coinciding with the eclipse, cannot be mere coincidence." We moved next to the observatory, a towering stone structure accessed by a narrow spiral staircase. The heavy oak door creaked open to reveal a circular chamber dominated by a grand brass telescope aimed skyward through a retractable roof. Charts and manuscripts cluttered every surface, while a faint scent of candle wax and old parchment lingered in the air. Holmes examined the telescope with a scientist's eye. Edmund was clearly devoted to his studies. Such an instrument is not merely for pastime, but for serious research. He pulled from the corner a heavy leather satchel worn with travel and use. Opening it revealed several more notebooks, some filled with observational logs, others with complex calculations involving eclipse paths and celestial mechanics. I examined one notebook that included an intricate diagram showing the Earth, Sun, and Moon during the eclipse, overlaid with cryptic notes referencing the hidden hour and the eclipse's embrace. What could the hidden hour signify? I asked. Holmes tapped the paper. A time of great significance, Watson. Perhaps the precise moment when truth is revealed or concealed. Our examination was interrupted by the arrival of the estate's astrologer, an elderly man named Professor Thaddeus Crane. He was a thin, wiry figure with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted with a grave nod. "I have studied the skies all my life, yet this eclipse stirs more than scientific interest. The prophecy is known to me, though I fear its consequences." Holmes eyed him keenly. "Professor Crane, what can you tell us of this prophecy?" Crane adjusted his spectacles. "It dates back centuries, entwined with the Darlington lineage. The shadow heir is said to vanish at the moment the moon's shadow cloaks the sun, swallowed by darkness to preserve the family's fate. Should the timing be disrupted, catastrophe will follow. Edmund's disappearance at such a juncture is no accident." "Is this prophecy written down?" Holmes pressed. "Fragments, yes," Crane replied, "in the family archives, but the full text has been lost or hidden. Some say the will of Edmund's grandfather was forged, altering the line of succession and igniting enmity within the family." Holmes rubbed his chin thoughtfully. A forged will, an eclipse, an heir vanished like a specter. Each thread pulled tight against the other. I watched Holmes's mind work with relentless intensity, weaving together the strands of fact, superstition, and motive. It was clear that this was no simple kidnapping, but a puzzle layered with deception and celestial secrets. After the astrologer's departure, Holmes returned to the notebooks and charts, his fingers flying over the pages. "Watson, note this. Edmund's latest observations include anomalies in the moon's orbit. Slight deviations that could affect the timing of the eclipse by minutes that could change everything." I frowned. But why would such precision matter? Holmes's eyes sparkled. Because within those minutes lies the hidden hour, the moment when whatever secret Edmund sought would be revealed or concealed, and whoever wished to silence him knew this. As afternoon gave way to evening, the household gathered for dinner, a tense assembly that offered further insight into the fractured family dynamics. Present were Lady Eleanor, Lord Ambrose, the estate's steward Mr. Calvert, a stoic man with a hawkish nose, and the younger sister Miss Clara Darlington, a delicate but sharp-witted woman with a penchant for quiet observation. Conversations were cautious, eyes often cast downward or darting sideways, as if secrets hovered just out of reach. Lady Eleanor spoke with restrained dignity, while Lord Ambrose's face was lined with the stress of his position. Miss Clara's soft voice occasionally pierced the quiet, revealing glimpses of her keen intellect and perhaps hidden knowledge. Holmes engaged them with gentle questions, eliciting fragments of information, hints of family tensions over inheritance, whispered rumors of a clandestine suitor, and the uneasy presence of a distant cousin recently arrived from India, whose motives remained unclear. Throughout the meal, Holmes's gaze remained sharp, catching subtle exchanges, a tightened jaw, a fleeting glance, a nervous cough, that spoke volumes beneath the polite veneer. After dinner, Holmes invited me to the library, where we pored once more over the astronomical charts and the Darlington notebooks. The night deepened, and the gaslight flickered, casting tall shadows that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the mystery. "Watson," Holmes said, "the eclipse will last but a few minutes, but within those minutes lies a world of consequence. Edmund's disappearance, the forged will, the ancient prophecy, these are threads of a tapestry woven in both light and darkness." I could feel the weight of those words, as though the very stars themselves were conspirators in a plot yet to be fully revealed. "We must act swiftly," Holmes continued. "Our next steps will take us deeper into the family's past and into the heart of the eclipse's shadow." As I settled back into my chair, exhausted yet exhilarated, I knew this was but the beginning. The case of the eclipsed heir had already begun to eclipse all other thoughts, and its resolution would demand every ounce of Holmes's legendary genius and my own steadfast resolve. Chapter 3. the midnight conclave. The hours that followed dinner dragged like shadows lengthening beneath a waning moon. The heavy weight of secrets seemed to settle deeper into the very stones of the Darlington estate. Despite the warmth of the library's fire, a chill clung to the air, as though the house itself waited, breath held, for some unseen reckoning. Holmes, ever restless, refused to allow the evening to slip away into mere slumber. "Watson," he said quietly, his eyes gleaming with resolve, "there are matters which require our attention under the cloak of darkness. I propose we explore the family archives and the observatory once more, but not by daylight. The truth often reveals itself best in the dead of night." I nodded in agreement, aware that the hours ticking down to the next eclipse left little margin for delay. Later, as the great clock in the hall tolled the midnight hour with a solemn resonance, Holmes and I crept through the long corridors, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. The household was silent, save for the faint crackling of dying embers and the distant howl of the London wind. We first sought the family archives, a vast collection of leather-bound volumes and dust-laden manuscripts housed in a small chamber adjoining the library. The heavy scent of aged paper and binding glue filled the room as Holmes lit a single candle, the flickering flame casting long shadows upon the spines of ancient tomes. "Here, Watson," Holmes whispered, pulling forth a worn volume stamped with the Darlington crest. "The chronicles of the family, including genealogies, letters, and, I suspect, the original will we believe forged." As we leafed through brittle pages, a folded parchment slipped free and fluttered to the floor. Holmes caught it deftly, unfolding a faded document inscribed with elegant script and an unfamiliar symbol, a crescent moon entwined with a serpent. "Curious," Holmes mused. "A secret sigil, perhaps? Marking a covenant or warning?" I looked over his shoulder, the words faint but legible. "The shadow heir shall vanish beneath the eclipse's embrace, and truth shall be veiled until the stars align anew. Beware the serpent's coil, lest the family be undone." A chill ran down my spine. Before we could ponder further, a sudden noise echoed through the hallway, a hushed murmur, footsteps barely audible but distinct. We exchanged glances and extinguished the candle, plunging the room into near darkness. Holmes motioned for silence, and we moved stealthily toward the source, a door at the end of the corridor, ajar just enough to reveal flickering candlelight beyond. Peering inside, we witnessed a clandestine gathering: Lord Ambrose, the steward Mr. Calvert, and a shadowy figure I did not recognize. Their voices were low, urgent. "The next eclipse will seal our fate," Ambrose said, tension thick in his tone. "If Edmund reveals the truth, all is lost." The stranger's voice was gravely, cloaked in menace. "Then we must act before the heavens darken again. The will must remain untouched. The serpent's coil must not loosen." Holmes's eyes burned with recognition. "Watson," he breathed, "we have stumbled upon a conspiracy within the family itself. The eclipse is but a stage for darker deeds." The meeting broke up abruptly, the figures scattering like shadows at dawn. Holmes and I retreated silently to the library, minds aflame with questions. "We tread a perilous path, my friend," Holmes said. "The eclipse is no longer merely an astronomical event. It is the fulcrum upon which the fate of the Darlington legacy balances." As the first pale light of dawn crept through the heavy curtains, I realized that our investigation had plunged into the heart of a labyrinthine mystery, one where celestial phenomena, ancient prophecy, and mortal greed intertwined with deadly consequence. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. As the gray fingers of dawn began to creep through the tall windows, I could scarcely shake the sensation that we had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated, his mind already leaping forward to the next steps. The conspirator's words lingered in my mind. The serpent's coil must not loosen. Over a sparse breakfast served in the gloomy morning room, Lady Eleanor greeted us with a weary yet hopeful smile. "Have you made progress, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Holmes chose his words carefully. "Progress, Lady Darlington, though the shadows deepen. It appears that the threat to your son and your family's legacy is more profound than a simple kidnapping." She swallowed hard, glancing at Lord Ambrose, who sat across the table, his expression unreadable. Miss Clara sat quietly beside him, eyes fixed on her teacup. "Do you believe Edmund is alive?" I ventured. Holmes's gaze was steady. It is too soon to say, but whoever took him acts with a motive far more complex than ransom. The timing with the eclipse, the forged will, the ancient prophecy, all suggest a calculated plan. After breakfast, we requested access to the estate grounds, particularly the vast gardens that surrounded the observatory. It was there, Holmes explained, that celestial alignments could be observed and understood in their truest form. The eclipse, after all, was not simply a spectacle, but a cryptic message. We walked beneath towering oaks and elm trees, their leaves whispering secrets in the gentle morning breeze. The air was tinged with the scent of damp earth and blooming roses, but beneath the beauty lurked unease. Holmes stopped beside a stone sundial, its gnomon casting a sharp shadow in the weak sunlight. He studied it intently. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The sundial marks not only the passing of hours, but when paired with Edmund's notes, it reveals a more intricate calendar, a celestial code tied to the eclipses and the hidden hour." I peered over his shoulder at the sundial's surface, where etched symbols mirrored those we'd seen in Edmund's manuscripts. "You think Edmund was using this to predict something beyond mere astronomy?" "Precisely. There is a hidden chronology, a secret clock that counts down not just days, but moments of significance." Our reverie was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Miss Clara, who approached with quiet grace. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly. "I overheard the midnight meeting. I cannot stand idle while my brother remains lost. There are things you do not yet know, secrets the family guards jealously." Holmes fixed her with a sharp gaze. "Miss Darlington, your courage is commendable. Will you share what you know?" She glanced around nervously, then nodded. The Darlington legacy is intertwined with more than prophecy. Our ancestors dabbled in the occult, seeking power through celestial events. Edmund believed that the eclipse was a key, an opportunity to uncover hidden truths. "Occult?" I echoed, surprised. "Yes," she replied. "There are tales of ancient rituals performed in the observatory during eclipses to protect the family line, but some believe those rituals also invited dark forces." Holmes rubbed his temples. "A tangled web indeed. The eclipse may be a metaphor and a mechanism, both a shield and a dagger." She hesitated, then added, "There is one more thing. Edmund confided in me about a secret chamber beneath the observatory, accessible only during the eclipse's totality. He said it held the final clue." Our curiosity ignited. We hurried to the observatory once more, this time searching for the secret chamber. Holmes examined the stone floor, the wooden beams, the intricate ironwork of the telescope's mount. At last, he found a loose flagstone near the base of the telescope, concealed beneath a faded rug. With effort, he lifted it to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Torches lit, we ventured downward into a subterranean chamber carved from stone. The air was cool and damp, filled with the musty scent of forgotten years. Walls were lined with ancient inscriptions, some celestial, others arcane. At the center stood a pedestal upon which rested a leather-bound tome, its cover embossed with the serpent and crescent moon symbol. Holmes carefully opened the book, revealing pages filled with diagrams, star charts, and handwritten notes in a cramped but elegant script. "This," Holmes said, "is Edmund's final journal, a record of his research into the eclipse and the prophecy. Here lie the answers we seek." As we read, a pattern emerged, references to the eclipsed hour, a moment when shadows and light merge, and the heir's true fate, cloaked in metaphor and enigma. Suddenly, a sound echoed from above, the heavy footsteps of approaching men. Holmes extinguished the torch, and we hid in the shadows as the door creaked open. The figures entered: Lord Ambrose, Mr. Calvert, and the mysterious stranger from the midnight meeting. Their voices were harsh and urgent. "The boy must not return," Ambrose growled. "The will's forgery must stand. The family's power depends on it." The stranger's voice was colder still. "The eclipse will soon end. If he reveals the truth, everything is lost." Holmes's grip tightened on the journal. "Watson, this confirms our fears. We face enemies not just of flesh and blood, but of legacy and dark intent." As they departed, Holmes whispered, "We must protect Edmund and uncover the truth before the eclipse closes the shadows forever." Emerging from our hiding place, I realized the stakes had never been higher. The coming eclipse was not only a celestial phenomenon, but a deadly countdown. Chapter 4. The Eclipse's Veil. The morning after our discovery in the hidden chamber was heavy with a silence that seemed to press upon every breath. Lady Eleanor's anxious eyes met mine briefly, but no words were spoken. The Darlington estate, with all its grandeur, felt suddenly smaller, as if the shadows we had uncovered had begun to shrink its walls inward. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street late that afternoon, the weight of the case pressing upon us like a dark cloud. The streets of London bustled on, oblivious to the deadly game unfolding under the eclipsed sun. Yet beneath the mundane clamor, the city itself seemed poised for change, a shift marked not by clocks, but by celestial cycles. At our rooms, Holmes spread out the contents of Edmund's journal and the Darlington archives on the table. Maps, star charts, and arcane symbols mingled with intricate notes in Edmund's delicate script. "The eclipse is imminent, Watson," Holmes said, eyes gleaming with urgency. "We have less than 48 hours until the moment when shadow consumes the sun. If Edmund remains hidden or worse, in danger, we must act swiftly." I nodded, feeling the pressing weight of time. "What is our next move?" Holmes's fingers traced a series of notes, calculations overlaying the path of the eclipse across England. "The eclipse will first touch Cornwall, then travel northeast, its shadow crossing over London precisely at its zenith. Edmund's last observations were focused on this path, the very places where the prophecy's power is said to manifest." "Manifest how?" I asked, uneasy. Holmes tapped a curious notation. "There is mention of the eclipsed veil, a fleeting moment when past and future, truth and deception, intertwine. It is during this time that Edmund hoped to reveal the forged will and the identity of those who sought to bury it." I frowned. "And the family? Are they all implicated?" Holmes shook his head. "Not all, but some are complicit in maintaining the shadow. The midnight meeting confirmed as much. Our task is to untangle friend from foe and ensure Edmund's safe return before the veil descends." We decided to consult an expert outside the Darlington circle, a certain Mr. Reginald Fairchild, a renowned London antiquarian and scholar of arcane manuscripts. Holmes had corresponded with Fairchild previously, and his knowledge of prophetic texts and historical forgery was unrivaled. The following day, we found Fairchild in his cluttered study on Fleet Street. Shelves groaned under the weight of dusty tomes, curious artifacts, and flickering candles. "Holmes, Watson!" Fairchild greeted us with a theatrical bow, eyes twinkling. "What celestial mystery brings you to my humble abode?" Holmes wasted no time. "Reginald, we face a case entwined with ancient prophecy, forged wills, and an eclipse poised to reveal or conceal a noble heir's fate. We require your expertise in deciphering a text recently uncovered in the Darlington archives." Fairchild's expression grew grave as we unfurled Edmund's journal. He pored over the pages, muttering arcane phrases and pointing to symbols with trembling fingers. "This serpent and crescent emblem," he whispered, "belongs to an obscure 16th century order known as the Eclipse Brotherhood. They were said to guard secrets linked to eclipses, secrets that could shift the balance of power." Holmes leaned in. "What of the eclipsed veil?" Fairchild adjusted his spectacles. "A metaphor and a ritual entwined. During the eclipse's totality, certain symbols align, opening a veil between worlds, a moment when hidden truths may surface. However, such knowledge comes with peril. The Brotherhood warned of the shadow heir, a fate tied to blood and betrayal." The clock ticked ominously as we absorbed this. Holmes closed the journal with a decisive snap. "We must prepare, Watson. The eclipse will be the stage upon which the final act unfolds. Our challenge is to protect Edmund, expose the forgers, and navigate a web of superstition and treachery." As we departed Fairchild's study, the sky above London was already beginning to darken, the moon's shadow creeping silently across the sun. The case was no longer merely a pursuit of justice. It had become a battle against time itself, beneath the eclipsed veil. The sky above London began to deepen from a bright morning blue to a curious, muted gray, the sunlight waning as the moon's dark disk edged over the sun. Streets that were once vibrant with life now carried a hushed expectancy, as if the city itself anticipated a moment of profound transformation. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street with heavy steps, the weight of our discoveries from Fairchild's study settling deep in our minds. The concept of the eclipsed veil, a fleeting convergence of hidden truths and perilous revelation, struck me as both poetic and chilling. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, his restless mind already turning over the implications. "Watson," he said quietly, "we must ensure Edmund's safety before the eclipse reaches totality. Every moment lost is a moment gained by those who seek to silence him forever." I glanced at the clock. "We have less than 12 hours." Holmes nodded grimly. "Time is the final adversary." Our first task was to return to the Darlington estate. Lady Eleanor had insisted we remain close, her eyes pleading for any scrap of news. Upon our arrival, the estate was unusually subdued. Servants moved about with a nervous haste. The air was thick with apprehension. We sought out Lady Eleanor, who greeted us with a fragile hope. "Have you discovered anything more?" she asked. Holmes was frank. "We know the eclipse is pivotal. Edmund's fate, the forged will, and the family's darkest secrets will all come to light. But there are still shadows within shadows, and enemies who will stop at nothing." Before Lady Eleanor could reply, a sudden commotion erupted outside. We hurried to the observatory's entrance to find a small crowd gathered around a man, pale and disheveled, clutching a bundle of papers. It was Edmund's tutor, Mr. Alistair Reed, a scholarly man of reserved demeanor but resolute character. "They sent me to find you," Reed said breathlessly. "Edmund, he escaped. He is hidden but fearful. They pursue him relentlessly." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Where?" Reed produced a hastily scrawled map, marked with cryptic symbols and routes through the surrounding countryside. "Near the ruins of old Harrogate Abbey," Reed explained. "Edmund sought refuge there. He believed the Abbey's crypt held answers, connections to the prophecy and the eclipse." Without hesitation, Holmes and I prepared to depart. Lady Eleanor pressed a small satchel into my hands. "Take this," she said, "for your journey, and be careful." The path to Harrogate was rugged, winding through dense woods and mist-shrouded fields. As twilight fell, the sky grew darker, the eclipse's shadow swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. At the ruins, we found Edmund, a gaunt figure cloaked in desperation, his eyes wild with fear and urgency. "Holmes," he whispered, clutching the journal, "they lie. The forged will is only the beginning. There is a deeper secret, one that could destroy us all." He led us into the crypt, where ancient stone pillars rose like sentinels, their surfaces carved with celestial symbols mirroring those in his journal. "There is a mechanism," Edmund explained, "an ancient device that aligns only during the eclipse's totality. It reveals the true lineage, the rightful heir." Holmes examined the contraption, a complex assembly of gears and lenses designed to capture the sun's fading light. "As the eclipse reaches its peak," Holmes said, "this device will unveil the hidden truth. But we must protect it from those who seek to destroy it." Suddenly, a shadow fell across the crypt entrance. Figures emerged, Ambrose, Calvert, and the mysterious stranger, their faces masks of cold resolve. "End of the line, Edmund," Ambrose sneered. "Your game is over." Holmes stepped forward, cane in hand. "I think not." What followed was a tense confrontation beneath the eclipsed sky, where loyalty and deception clashed in whispers and threats. The final act was fast approaching, the eclipse's veil about to lift or fall forever. The cold air in the crypt seemed to constrict around us as Ambrose, Calvert, and the stranger stepped forward, their faces illuminated by the eerie twilight of the eclipsed sun filtering through cracks in the ancient stone walls. The weight of their presence was oppressive, a tangible menace pressing against the fragile hope Edmund and we clung to. Holmes's voice was low but steely. "Your pursuit ends here. Whatever dark ambitions you harbor, this device, and the truth it reveals, will see daylight." Ambrose laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Truth is a luxury reserved for those who hold power, Mr. Holmes. The Darlington name will remain ours, forged will and all. No celestial trickery will change that." The stranger stepped closer, eyes glinting. "And if the device reveals anything contrary to your interests, Lord Ambrose, then it must be silenced." Calvert produced a small pistol, its cold metal gleaming ominously. My heart thudded as the tension coiled tighter. Holmes, unflinching, raised a finger. "I suggest you reconsider. Violence here risks more than just mortal lives. The eclipse is near. Disturbing this moment may bring consequences beyond your comprehension." The stranger's gaze flickered with a moment of hesitation, but Ambrose barked an order. "Seize them!" Chaos erupted. Holmes lunged forward, his cane striking Calvert's wrist, sending the pistol clattering to the stone floor. I grappled with the stranger, struggling against his brute strength. Edmund darted behind a pillar, clutching the journal as if it were a talisman. Amid the scuffle, a sudden shaft of light pierced through the crypt's aperture. The eclipse was reaching totality, the sun's corona blazing like a ring of fire around the moon's shadow. Holmes glanced upward, then back to the mechanism. "Now, Edmund?" With trembling hands, Edmund adjusted the ancient device. Gears turned slowly, lenses focused the dying light onto an etched crystal panel. The symbols glowed faintly, then burst into a radiant display of constellations and heraldic emblems. A hidden compartment slid open in the device's base, revealing a sealed parchment, its wax emblem bearing the Darlington crest, unmistakably authentic. Holmes snatched it up. "The true will!" Ambrose snarled in fury, lunging toward us, but Holmes was faster. With a deft movement, he incapacitated Ambrose while I restrained the stranger and Calvert. The room fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of those caught in the aftermath. Edmund stepped forward, pale but resolute. "This will restores the rightful heir," he said quietly. "It reveals the truth buried beneath lies and shadows." Holmes nodded. "The eclipse's veil has lifted, Watson. The truth stands revealed. Not in darkness, but in the light of reason and justice." As the moon's shadow receded and the sun reclaimed the sky, I felt a profound relief. A dawn not just of day, but of justice long deferred. The case of the eclipsed heir was far from over, but for now the shadows had been pushed back. And in that fragile clarity, hope flickered anew. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The first rays of the sun pierced through the heavy oak doors of Harrogate Abbey, casting long, trembling beams across the cold stone floor of the crypt. The eclipse was behind us, yet its shadow lingered, not just in the fading darkness, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed the night's revelations. Holmes stood near the ancient mechanism, the recovered will held reverently in his hand. His eyes were bright with the fervor of a man who had glimpsed a profound truth, but knew the journey was far from complete. Edmund Darlington sat nearby, exhausted but visibly relieved. "It feels as though a great weight has been lifted," he murmured, "yet I fear the past we unearthed is only the beginning." Lady Eleanor's arrival at the Abbey that morning brought a new tension. Her face, usually composed, betrayed a complex mixture of gratitude and sorrow as she embraced her son, but her eyes also flickered with the weight of family secrets still concealed. "Mother," Edmund said gently, "the truth of the will changes everything. But what of the prophecy? What of the Eclipse Brotherhood and the dark forces that linger over our name?" Holmes folded the will carefully. The Brotherhood's influence is a shadow cast long over generations, but their power wanes in the light of truth. What remains is for you and your family to confront. Our departure from Harrogate was somber, the air still thick with the night's mysteries. Back in London, Holmes and I convened at Baker Street, poring over documents and cross-referencing the newly revealed will with historical records and the cryptic notes left by Edmund's ancestors. One particular passage in Edmund's journal caught Holmes's keen eye, a reference to a hidden ledger, long thought lost, which detailed the Brotherhood's final rites and perhaps the key to fully dismantling their hold. "It is said to reside in the private collection of Lord Barrowby," Holmes mused, "a man of considerable influence and, I suspect, no stranger to clandestine dealings." The game was far from over. Holmes prepared to navigate the treacherous social labyrinth of Victorian London's aristocracy, where alliances shifted like sand, and the past shadows threatened to engulf the present. As for me, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The case of the eclipsed heir was no longer simply a matter of missing persons or forged documents. It was a battle for truth, legacy, and perhaps redemption. The coming days promised revelations and dangers that would test our resolve and intellect to their limits. The pale morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of Harrogate Abbey as we prepared to depart. Edmund's reunion with Lady Eleanor was poignant, yet tinged with an unspoken tension, as if the family's collective sigh of relief masked deeper, unhealed wounds. Lady Eleanor, her face composed yet weary, grasped Edmund's hands. "My son, you have returned from the shadows, but I fear the shadows will not so easily release their hold." Edmund's eyes were steady. "Mother, we have uncovered the forged will, the secret chamber, the ancient order that has haunted our bloodline for centuries. Now we must confront the Brotherhood itself. Holmes's gaze swept the Abbey's cavernous interior. The Brotherhood's reach is not limited to rural ruins and secret crypts. Their tendrils extend into the heart of London's elite. I caught a flicker of resolve in Edmund's expression. Then we must prepare. The true fight lies ahead. Our journey back to London was quiet, punctuated only by the distant tolling of church bells and the murmured conversations of villagers beginning their day. Yet within my mind, a tempest churned. The eclipse had lifted the veil, but what lay beneath was more intricate than I could have imagined. Back at 221B Baker Street, Holmes spread the recovered will across the cluttered table. The parchment was old yet pristine, its seals intact. The signature was unmistakable, the true mark of Edmund's grandfather, confirming his rightful claim to the Darlington legacy. But a will alone cannot undo the years of deception, Holmes observed, his fingers tracing the fine script. We must expose those who forged the false document and understand what they hope to gain. Edmund leaned in, tracing the line of succession. The forged will placed a distant relative, a man named Bartholomew Calvert, as heir. That name appeared during the midnight meeting. Ambrose's accomplice. Holmes nodded. Indeed, and it brings us to Lord Barrowby. I raised an eyebrow. I confess, I had not heard of him before. Holmes smiled thinly. A man of subtle influence, Barrowby owns several estates and commands respect in both political and social circles. But rumors swirl, whispers of secret societies and occult sympathies. It would be no surprise if he were linked to the Eclipse Brotherhood. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression cautious. A visitor, Mr. Holmes. A Miss Lavinia Gray requests to see you. She says it's urgent. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Show her in. Moments later, a slender woman with sharp features and keen eyes stepped inside. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, and her demeanor carried an air of quiet determination. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, she began. I am a scholar of antiquities and have been following the recent events surrounding the Darlington family closely. I believe I can offer information that may assist your investigation. Holmes gestured for her to continue, and she produced a small leather-bound book. This is a rare manuscript I obtained from a private collection. It contains records related to the Eclipse Brotherhood, including their ceremonies and ledgers. I glanced at Holmes, who took the book with a reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. Miss Gray, your timing is impeccable, Holmes said. Pray, tell us what you have uncovered. She settled into a chair. The Brotherhood was founded in the late 1500s by a group of noblemen obsessed with harnessing celestial events to consolidate power. They believed eclipses were moments when the natural and supernatural converged, allowing for manipulation of fate. Holmes's eyes gleamed. This aligns with the inscriptions and artifacts found at Harrogate. And the ledger? Does it detail their holdings or rituals? Yes, Miss Gray replied. And more importantly, it hints at a betrayal within their ranks, a fracture that could explain the forged will and the internal conflict threatening to unravel their secrecy. Holmes leaned forward, fingers interlaced. This is precisely the lead we needed. I found myself fascinated by Miss Gray's calm confidence and breadth of knowledge. She was an unexpected ally in our quest, yet there was something guarded about her, a shadow beneath the scholar's poise. As we delved into the manuscript, late afternoon gave way to dusk. The streets outside grew dim, gas lamps flickering to life in the gathering gloom. The city's heartbeat quickened with the approach of evening, yet within 221B, a different kind of urgency pulsed. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. The ledger mentions a midnight covenant, a final gathering of Brotherhood members to decide the fate of the Darlington legacy. It is set to take place in 3 days, coinciding with the next lunar cycle. 3 days, I repeated. That is soon. Holmes nodded, which means we have little time to prepare. Miss Gray's expression hardened. The covenant is not merely a meeting. It is a ritual intended to renew their power. If the forged will is not fully discredited by then, they will move to solidify their claim, possibly by darker means. A chill crept down my spine. The stakes were higher than ever. Holmes stood abruptly. Watson, we must gain entry to this gathering to understand their plans and expose their machinations before they can act. The plan took shape swiftly. Holmes would use his network of contacts to infiltrate the aristocratic circles where the Brotherhood's influence was strongest, while I would assist Edmund and Lady Eleanor in securing their position and gathering evidence. As the night deepened, the shadows lengthened, but so did our resolve. The case of the eclipsed heir was no longer a mere mystery. It had become a war against an ancient darkness cloaked in velvet and deceit. The path ahead promised peril and revelation alike, but with Holmes's unparalleled intellect and our combined determination, I dared to believe justice might yet prevail. The night was far from over, and with every passing hour, the city's secret pulse quickened, echoing the approaching tide of the Midnight Covenant. Chapter 6. The Midnight Covenant. The air of London had grown heavy with a damp fog that seemed to rise from the very stones of the city. It clung to gas lamps and lamplighter alike, blurring outlines and muting sounds. A city half asleep, half watching. And within that shrouded gloom, Holmes and I prepared to step into the lion's den. The gathering known as the Midnight Covenant, as detailed in the ledger Miss Gray had uncovered, was to take place in a manor house on the outskirts of Belgravia, owned by none other than Lord Silas Barrowby. A man rarely seen in daylight hours, Barrowby was infamous in certain rarefied circles for his antiquarian collections and political maneuverings. It was whispered he possessed manuscripts older than the Magna Carta, and that he rarely made a move that did not serve his own ends. We had little time to secure an invitation, but Holmes had already begun weaving his web. I shall attend under the guise of a foreign antiquities broker, Herr Volker Reinhardt of Vienna, Holmes explained, pacing as I dressed in evening clothes far too fine for my usual taste. You, Watson, shall accompany me as a physician in my employ. These men are obsessed with the appearance of control. If we look as though we belong, they will not question. And what if they do? I asked, tightening my collar. Then we improvise. An hour later, a black carriage delivered us through the twisting streets to Barrowby's estate. The house loomed like something grown from shadow, its gables and arches biting into the fog. Uniformed footmen with pale expressions opened the wrought iron gates without speaking. We stepped into a world of silent grandeur. The entrance hall was vast and cold, adorned with mounted relics and ancient orreries. Guests, all men of wealth and distinction, moved like wraiths beneath a ceiling of painted stars. Holmes adjusted his monocle and leaned close to me. "Observe," he whispered. "No women, no servants in the main chambers, and every guest carries some token. Rings, pendants, cufflinks, all bearing the crescent eclipse." "Marking themselves as members," I murmured. A tall man with a silver beard approached, his eyes shrewd, and his smile more threat than welcome. "Herr Reinhardt," he said in fluent but accented German, "Lord Barrowby welcomes you. Your work on the Mesopotamian glyphs is much admired." Holmes bowed, flawlessly slipping into character. "An honor to be received, mein Herr." We were escorted into a vaulted chamber, a private library transformed for ritual. At the center stood a raised dais encircled by 12 high-backed chairs. Behind each, a torch flared. The smell of old incense and wax filled the air. On the far end of the room, a smaller black-robed figure awaited. Barrowby himself. Thin as a rail and draped in a ceremonial cloak, he looked less like a lord and more like an embalmed priest of some forgotten order. "Brothers," Barrowby began, his voice a rasp, "the eclipse has passed, but the covenant renews beneath the silver moon." The men took their seats without prompting. Holmes and I remained at the perimeter, watching. "Before us," Barrowby continued, "lies the question of succession. The Darlington line is fractured, but our agents have sown confusion, yet the boy lives, and the true will may surface. Should it emerge, we must act decisively." I felt Holmes's hand tense slightly at his side. Another figure stood, Lord Ambrose. "The will exists," he said flatly. "Holmes interfered in Harrogate, and the boy escaped, but the document has not yet been authenticated. We still have time to suppress it permanently." Barrowby raised a gloved hand. Violence must be the final recourse. First, discredit, disappear, then destroy. The man seated to his left, one I later identified as Sir Neville Catterick, a known arms broker, spoke next. "There is another matter. A woman, Lavinia Gray. She has obtained the Brotherhood ledger." Holmes's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. "She must be dealt with," Barrowby said. "Quietly. The covenant cannot risk exposure." I stepped slightly forward, heart pounding. Miss Grey, our ally, was now a marked target. Holmes raised a finger as if in thought, then spoke in his assumed accent. "Excuse me, meine Herren. If the will is your concern, then perhaps an exchange could be arranged." Barrowby turned, curious. "You possess it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I represent those who might." Barrowby stepped down from the dais, peering at Holmes. "Then you must bring it to me, within 48 hours, and in return, we may offer your employer considerable discretion." Holmes inclined his head. "Discretion is always valuable, mine lord." The meeting dissolved shortly thereafter. We returned to the carriage in silence, the fog outside now seemingly thicker, clinging like a curse. Once the door shut, Holmes dropped the accent. "We must move now, Watson. They mean to strike against Miss Grey and perhaps Edmund as well. What shall we do? We divide our efforts. You go to Lavinia, warn her and keep her hidden. I will return to Lady Eleanor and prepare the legal battle to authenticate the will. Time is no longer on our side." I nodded grimly. "What of Barrowby?" Holmes looked out the carriage window as it rattled over cobbles. "He is more than he appears. He has built an empire beneath the surface of our society. To defeat him, we must not merely reveal the will, we must unravel his secrets." We parted at the corner of Bedford Square. Holmes vanished into the night, a silhouette swallowed by mist. I redirected the carriage towards Southwark, where Miss Grey maintained a modest flat above the Society for Antiquarian Preservation. I arrived to find her packing hurriedly, manuscripts scattered like a whirlwind. "They've already come," she said before I could speak. "2 men. I saw them waiting across the road. I know what they are." "You must come with me," I said. "Holmes sent me to warn you. We'll find you a place to hide until the Covenant's scheme can be dismantled." She hesitated, clutching the ledger. "This book, what it contains, goes beyond a forged will or an heir's fate. The Brotherhood have manipulated kings and elections, wars and treaties. Edmund's life is the thread unraveling a century of deceit." "I believe you," I said, "but we need you alive to finish the work." That night, I spirited her away to a safe house Holmes maintained in Marylebone. It was a narrow brick building, outwardly unremarkable but fortified like a fortress within. Before dawn, Holmes returned. "They are tightening the noose," he said. "The Brotherhood has begun a whisper campaign to discredit Edmund. Letters, forged documents, even claims of mental instability." "And what of the will?" "I have submitted it to the probate office," he said, "but I do not trust the clerks. Some may be under Barrowby's influence. I've asked Mycroft for intervention." "Mycroft?" I asked. "You've involved your brother?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Let us say the machinery of empire is sometimes best used against itself." And so, as the moon waned and the Brotherhood circled its prey, we prepared. For war not of armies but of whispers and shadows. A war of names and signatures, secrets and silences. The Covenant's clock was ticking, and at its center, the truth. Eclipsed still, but drawing ever closer to the light. Chapter 7. A Conspiracy in Ink. It was a bitter morning, the sort where the very stones of London seemed to exhale cold, as if the city itself resented the intrusion of light. A steady drizzle fell in diagonal sheets, and the gutter waters carried scraps of forgotten paper, parliamentary broadsheets, tattered tradesman invoices, and hastily penned accusations, all soaked and indistinct. Yet for all the city's noise and commerce, something invisible and sinister coursed beneath it, like the faint, maddening tick of a clock whose chime meant ruin. Holmes had not slept. He sat hunched over his desk at Baker Street, sleeves rolled to the elbow, pipe cold and forgotten beside him, and a growing stack of correspondence arrayed like a battlefield map. "Watson," he said at length, his voice hoarse from disuse, "observe the seal." He passed me an envelope, heavy ivory parchment, the kind used by the uppermost ranks of society. The wax was a deep violet, marked with an unfamiliar sigil, a serpent swallowing its own tail, the ancient Ouroboros. "It was delivered an hour before dawn," he added, "by hand." I turned the letter over. The script was fine, but the message itself was stark. "Mr. Holmes, you meddle in affairs long buried. Turn back. This is your final warning." S. "Barrowby?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Too direct. He prefers intermediaries. No, this came from another quarter." He rose abruptly, drawing open the drapes. Outside, the street was still wet with rain. "I believe we are no longer playing a single game, Watson. Multiple players now crowd the board, each pursuing their own objective." Who else stands to gain from the forged will? More than we guessed, Holmes murmured. And that, he gestured to the letter, is not just a warning, it's a test. Before I could question him further, a knock rattled the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young boy, no more than 12, his face pinched and pale. "A message from Miss Gray," he stammered. "She says they've broken into her offices, took everything." Holmes's face hardened. "Watson, with me, at once." Within the hour, we stood in the ruined upper floor of the Society for Antiquarian Preservation. Cabinets lay overturned, papers strewn like carrion. In the back room, a glass case had been shattered, its velvet lining barren where rare documents had once rested. Miss Gray stood amid the wreckage, her fists clenched at her sides. "They knew exactly what to take," she said. "Only the files on the Brotherhood. The rest they left untouched." I moved toward the desk, where a single page had been pinned with a letter opener. On it, the same Ouroboros seal had been hastily drawn in ink, this time encircling a single word, retract. Holmes studied it. A crude imitation. Whoever drew this lacks Barrowby's elegance. But it's clear, we're rattling cages. Miss Gray retrieved a folder from under her cloak. "I made copies. Not all of it, but enough." Holmes took it with a nod. "Then our work continues." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes laid out the stolen pages. Meticulously reconstructed records of Brotherhood holdings, payments, and cryptic marginalia. One note in particular caught his attention. A transaction dated May 3, 1858, between a B.C. and a solicitor named Hiram Nettlesworth. Holmes leaned back. Nettlesworth was involved in drafting the forged will. He left London 2 decades ago after a scandal, but his name keeps appearing in Brotherhood ledgers. If he lives still, he may hold the key to the forgery. "Do we know where he went?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Retired to Kent. He lives under a different name, something bucolic. Applethorpe or Apsefield." Before nightfall, we were on the 5:45 train to Ashford. The Kent countryside rolled past in muddy greens and slate grays, a land of hedgerows and stone fences. We arrived after dark, following a local's directions to a crumbling manor just beyond the edge of Apsefield. The house was cloaked in ivy and silence. Nettlesworth, now calling himself Harold Applegate, answered the door with the look of a man who had been waiting too long for something terrible to arrive. "You're not collectors," he rasped. "You've come about the will." Holmes inclined his head. "We've come about the truth." The old man led us into a fire-lit drawing room, its walls lined with dusty law books and half-drunk brandy bottles. He moved with difficulty, every step a reluctant confession. "I was paid handsomely to forge the Darlington will, but I didn't know the extent, not until after the ink had dried. They sent someone to ensure my silence. I was told to disappear, and I did." "Who?" Holmes asked. "Who gave the order?" Nettlesworth hesitated. "Not Barrowby. It came through a man named Everard Quince." Holmes's brow furrowed. "I know that name, a financier with property in the West Indies. But publicly—" "He's dead," I said. Nettlesworth nodded. "Declared so. But he isn't. He's the Brotherhood's financier, their fixer, the money behind the web." Holmes sat very still. "Watson," he said, "what if Barrowby is not the spider, but merely the web's centerpiece? Decorative, feared, but not the one who spins." "Then Quince is the spider." "Yes." We took a signed affidavit from Nettlesworth before leaving, proof of the forgery, names, dates, and payment trails. We left him in his old chair by the fire, a man consumed by remorse, but now, perhaps, vindicated. As we rode back to London, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. When he finally spoke, it was with quiet certainty. "We are not fighting a cabal of occultists. We are fighting a syndicate, one that uses prophecy and ritual as masks, tools to control inheritance, wealth, politics. And the Eclipse? A convenient distraction, a symbol to bind the foolish, but some among them believe it deeply, and that makes them unpredictable." Upon our return, Holmes delivered the affidavit to Mycroft via private courier. By morning, the wheels of government had begun to turn. Quiet inquiries, frozen accounts, whispered warnings to certain peers to remain abroad indefinitely. Yet the Brotherhood was not idle. 2 days later, Edmund was attacked on the steps of the probate court. He survived with a bruised rib and a laceration across the cheek, but the message was clear. No more delays. Holmes called a council at Baker Street. Lady Eleanor, Miss Gray, Edmund, myself. "They know the will is legitimate," Holmes said. They know their web unravels, but they have one last card to play. Which is? Asked Lady Eleanor. They will try to disappear Edmund again, but not through kidnapping. I stared. Assassination, Holmes nodded. Tomorrow, the will enters public record. Edmund must survive until noon. After that, the Darlington estate will be his beyond contestation. Lady Eleanor stood, the weight of history etched in her face. Then let them come. We will not yield. The clock ticked toward the final act, and all of London, whether it knew it or not, stood on the edge of revelation. Chapter 8, Noon of the Knife. We awoke to a city half swallowed by shadow. The morning of May 21st dawned with a peculiar hush. Fog draped itself in thick veils across the streets, and though gas lamps still glowed, they did little to part the murk. Londoners moved as though beneath some great pressure, as if the heavens had grown too heavy for their shoulders. The newspaper spoke of nothing but the coming validation of the Darlington will. Rumors flared like match heads, that the missing heir had returned, that Lady Eleanor had bribed the crown, that Sherlock Holmes had uncovered a secret cult bent on war. And amid this sea of half-truths and outright lies, the Brotherhood prepared to strike. At Baker Street, Holmes stood before the hearth, trimming the wick of an oil lamp with meticulous care. Today, he said, they must succeed. They've failed in the shadows, so they will try in daylight. Crude but effective. Do we know how? I asked, checking the chamber of my revolver. He shook his head. We only know that it will be close. Very close. And they will not rely on strangers. They'll send one of their own, someone Edmund would never suspect. At 9 o'clock, Edmund arrived with Miss Grey. His cheek was bandaged, but his eyes blazed. He had grown in confidence these past weeks. Not the boy who once dithered over his telescope, but a man shaped by peril. They'll come for me, he said. I'm ready. Holmes smiled faintly. Good, because we're going to let them try. I blinked. What? Holmes turned. We've laid traps. Every entrance to the courthouse is watched. Every carriage followed. Every solicitor in the probate office vetted by Mycroft's men. But still, they will try. So we must give them their opportunity and catch them in the act. We departed Baker Street at 10:30 in an unmarked brougham. Inside, the four of us sat tense and silent. Holmes, Edmund, Miss Grey, and I. The windows were curtained. The driver trusted. We circled Westminster once, then twice, until Holmes gave the signal and we approached the Royal Probate Office from the rear. A side door, long disused and not listed on modern schematics, had been cleared of debris the night before. As we stepped inside, I felt the old surge of dread, suspense thick as the air before a thunderclap. Holmes led us through quiet corridors, pausing to adjust his gloves with deliberate care. 3 men have entered posing as clerks, he murmured. 2 are outside the chamber. 1 is waiting within. We came at last to the main office, a tall chamber with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows. An actual judge, a pale-eyed man named Templeton, waited beside a desk cluttered with papers and the seal of the realm. Edmund stepped forward. I am Edmund Alaric Darlington. I have come to prove my right. The judge nodded once. Do you swear that this document is... The door slammed open. Gunfire, a blur of motion. The man posing as the clerk at the far end of the room had pulled a pistol, not toward Edmund, but toward Miss Grey. She staggered back, a crimson bloom at her shoulder. Before any of us could shout, the assassin turned his aim toward Edmund. But Holmes was faster. He struck from the side, his cane lashing out and catching the gunman's wrist. The pistol discharged upward into the ceiling, showering plaster. In the chaos, I drew my revolver and fired, once, clean and low. The man fell, clutching his leg, howling. Another gunman burst through the front doors, but Templeton, to my astonishment, drew a pistol of his own and fired, dropping the second man to the floor in a heap. Miss Grey, white-faced but conscious, sat clutching her wound. Not fatal, she managed. Holmes bound the first attacker's wrists with a length of cord from his coat pocket. You are under arrest, he said calmly. In the name of the crown. Templeton knelt beside the fallen man. Name? The man glared. You'll never prove a thing. Oh, but I already have, Holmes replied. Your companion, Lord Ambrose, was intercepted outside. His carriage contained letters, ledgers, a full confession, and your gun was planted with a residue only found at the Brotherhood's sanctum. You will hang, I expect. The man paled. By midday, word had spread across the city. The will had been authenticated. Edmund was now Lord Darlington. Barrowby's estate had been raided by agents of the Crown. He had fled, his whereabouts unknown. Everard Quince's name, long thought buried in the annals of commerce, now blazed across headlines as the architect of a criminal empire. His assets were frozen, his agents scattered. Miss Grey recovered swiftly, though the scar at her shoulder would remain. She never once complained. As we sat that night at Baker Street, exhausted, Holmes gazed into the fire. "There are victories," he said, "and then there are reprieves." This was the latter. "What do you mean?" I asked. "We won the battle. But the Brotherhood is not gone, only wounded. A serpent may lose a fang and yet bite again." He stood, crossing to the window where the stars had begun to emerge, faint against the thinning fog. "There will be another eclipse," he murmured. "Not of the sun, but of conscience. And when it comes, we must be ready." Outside, London breathed again. The fog had lifted. But Holmes remained at the glass, watching. Waiting. Yet victory, as Holmes had warned, proved no neat conclusion. It is not the nature of darkness to vanish quietly, nor of conspiracies to concede ground without redrawing their lines elsewhere. As we exited the Royal Probate Office, the light above London was already turning strange. The solar eclipse had begun. It started as a dimming, subtle at first, like a veil drawn across the sun by invisible hands. Gas lamps flickered to life as confusion rippled through the streets. In the square outside the courthouse, onlookers gathered with smoked glass and paper visors, some laughing nervously, others pointing to the heavens in silence. Holmes turned his gaze skyward. "They will use the eclipse as distraction. They always have." I looked at him sharply. "What else have they planned?" He didn't answer at once. Instead, he pulled from his coat a crumpled page, an astronomical chart. It had been taken from the observatory, the one where Edmund had disappeared weeks prior. On it were 3 overlapping paths of totality, eclipses past and future. Holmes's finger tapped a point on the chart, marked with the initials E. "Everard Quince," he said. "He is in London. I wager he never left. He has always manipulated things from the shadows. But now, with Barrowby gone and his network unraveling, he may act in desperation." "You think he'll try to silence someone else?" "I think," Holmes said grimly, "he'll try to destroy the one place left that could expose the full depth of the conspiracy." I felt a chill. The observatory. Holmes nodded. "There is evidence there, buried in charts, encoded in the margins of Edmund's journals, and confirmed in those recovered by Miss Grey. Together they form a timeline of manipulation, all hinged on celestial events. It's not astrology they practiced. It's astronomy weaponized. Predictive scheduling of disappearances, murders, even political upheaval. We didn't delay. Holmes requisitioned a fast carriage under Mycroft's authority. Within the hour, we were rattling along the cobbled roads toward Highgate Hill, the observatory spire already visible against the crescented sky. The eclipse approached totality. At the gates, we found them already ajar, swung wide on their rusted hinges. Holmes gestured for silence. We entered carefully, revolvers drawn. Inside, the observatory was darker than it should have been. The glass dome had been shuttered, the main lens dismantled. Journals had been removed from shelves, maps scattered or burned, but someone was still there. A figure moved near the charting room. Holmes stepped forward. "Quince, we know it's you." The man turned slowly. He wore no mask, no robe of esoteric office, only a tailored black suit, perfectly cut, his silver hair neatly combed. His face was lean and sharp, the eyes behind his wire spectacles hard as flint. "You are persistent," he said softly. "But then your brother always said as much." Holmes tilted his head. "You knew Mycroft?" "I know him," Quince replied. "I funded his rise. We all did. The Brotherhood ensures the best men arrive in the right places. Until now. You forged the will." Quince didn't flinch. I corrected it. The Darlington line was weak, easy to mold, until that boy and his bloody stars got in the way. He glanced upward. Through the narrow gap in the dome, the sun was almost consumed. Just a sliver remained. Holmes stepped forward. "It's over. You're surrounded. Even now, officers wait on the grounds." Quince smiled. "You think this is about inheritance? About land? You've only ever seen half the game, Holmes." And then he reached into his coat. I moved instinctively, raising my weapon, but Holmes was faster. He didn't shoot. He threw the remains of the chart. It struck Quince's hand just as he drew a small brass-capped device, later revealed to be a detonator. The object clattered across the floor and came to rest beneath an overturned telescope. Quince lunged. Holmes tackled him mid-step. They crashed into a cabinet of star maps, scattering vellum and dust. I rushed forward, seizing the detonator. There was no switch, only a pressure cap. One squeeze and the gas line beneath the observatory, rerouted for months, would have ignited. Holmes rose, breathing heavily. Quince lay pinned beneath him, bound in strips of torn canvas and writhing with rage. "You don't understand what's coming," he spat. "The stars are not yours to command." "No," Holmes replied coldly, "but neither are they yours to hide behind." Outside, a great cheer rose from the crowd. The eclipse had reached totality, and for a full 90 seconds, day became night. It was not lost on me, as Holmes and I emerged from the observatory with Quince between us, that the darkness felt no longer ominous, but cleansed, like a final curtain drawn across the last act of a poisoned play. That evening, under stars newly revealed and scrubbed of their counterfeit meanings, we sat once more in Baker Street. Edmund was quiet, but not afraid. He held the telescope lens from his family's observatory in one hand, as though to weigh the past against the future. "What now?" he asked. Holmes poured a measure of brandy into his glass. "Now you lead," he said, "not as the Darlington heir, but as a man who saw the sky for what it was, and refused to let it be rewritten." Miss Gray raised her glass, her bandage now clean and tight. "To the stars," she said. We drank. Outside, London moved on, its people unaware of the conspiracy unwound, the air reclaimed, the truth restored. And above us, the moon began to slip away from the face of the sun. Light returned. But Holmes did not look up. He studied the charts, still spread across his desk, and marked a single date in red. August 12th, 1891. Total eclipse, Tunisia. I caught the gleam in his eye and felt a familiar thrill. The game, it seemed, was not yet over. Chapter 9. Shadows over Carthage. It is often said that when darkness flees, it leaves behind a deeper quiet than light ever permits. The aftermath of the solar eclipse over London confirmed the sentiment, and yet within days, Holmes was again studying charts, scanning the foreign papers, and writing coded letters to diplomatic attachés in Tunis and Algiers. There was a tautness in his every movement, as though the recent victory had only drawn taut the next bowstring. One evening, as I returned to Baker Street after a quiet dinner with Mary, I found Holmes seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by translated fragments of Punic inscriptions and astronomical diagrams drawn by a monk named Jean-Paul de Montfaucon in the 16th century. "Watson," he said without looking up, "we must pack for Tunisia." Tunisia? Carthage, to be precise. The Brotherhood never truly operated without a spiritual home, and I believe they found it in the ruins of empire. Their esoteric calendar is older than we supposed, based on alignments not just of stars, but of eclipses viewed from specific meridians. There is a second sect, likely hidden for centuries, and they will not let Quince's failure go unanswered. Within 3 days, we had boarded a steamer bound for Tunis, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade, who had requested, in the wake of his humiliation over the Darlington affair, to accompany us in person and redeem his station. The voyage was long and ill-tempered, the Mediterranean offering none of the serene charm one imagines in postcards. Holmes spent the crossing poring over astronomical almanacs and consulting with Arab crewmen about local legends. He slept scarcely, but when he did, he muttered names in his dreams: Ashur, Nabonidus, Tammuz. Carthage met us with its usual contradictions: the scent of salt and jasmine, the cries of merchants in the souk, the ruins smoldering under noon's sun. There we were met by a contact of Holmes's, a Professor Rafiq Ben Khalil, who served as director of the archaeological mission at Bursa Hill. He greeted us in fluent English and led us into a cramped study beneath the French governor's villa. The star priests, as your friend calls them, Khalil said, were likely a Ptolemaic cult, but one uniquely fixated on eclipses and geometric harmony. We've uncovered a stele bearing a sequence of lunar glyphs matching your chart. Holmes examined the artifact in silence. Then he turned, his voice taut with calculation. They meet here on the night of August 12th, when the path of the next eclipse falls over this very latitude. That is their communion, their true ritual. We set to work. With the help of Khalil's assistance and a quiet grant from the British consulate, we laid an ambush among the ruins. The Brotherhood, we believed, would gather at the Temple of Tanit, half collapsed, and still defiant after millennia. We disguised ourselves as laborers, catalogers, and even a pair of French tourists. Holmes grew a beard. Lestrade took to the local dress. As the fateful night approached, the heat grew unbearable. The moon waxed fat above us, and Holmes grew quieter with each hour, as though conserving breath for the confrontation. On August 12th, we waited beneath Bursa. They came at moonrise. A dozen robed figures, silent, bearing not torches but lanterns of blue glass. They spoke no words but moved with a coordinated grace, like dancers in a macabre theater. They entered the temple through a narrow corridor Holmes had earlier noted as ideal for a chokehold. Holmes signaled. We struck with speed and precision. Lestrade and 2 Arab officers blocked the western exit. Holmes and I moved in from the altar, revolvers drawn. One figure lunged, blade flashing in the eclipse-drenched gloom, but Holmes parried with the butt of his revolver and struck him senseless. The others fell back, only to find their retreat cut off. Amidst the scuffle, one figure attempted to destroy a bundle of scrolls. I seized it, tore it from his grasp, and held it aloft. Ancient vellum, bearing charts, names, and a list of planned eclipses reaching into the next decade. Holmes stepped to the center of the temple, lit now by partial eclipse, and pulled back the hood of the last captured figure. It was a woman. Her face was lined with ritual scars. She stared at Holmes with a hatred I cannot forget. "The light dies," she whispered, "but the eye remembers." Holmes said nothing, but I could see the weight in his expression. That night, as the eclipse passed and the Brotherhood was taken into custody, we sat once more under unfamiliar stars. The danger was not over, but a long page had turned. "There is always another eclipse," Holmes said, lighting a cigarette with a shaky hand. "But not always the same shadows." And I, watching the last sliver of moonlight fade from the ruins of Carthage, believed him. We arrived in Tunis under a veil of mistrust and heat. The harbor was a blur of bleached stone and screaming gulls, with brine thick in the air and the sun a white coin in the sky. Though Tunisia was technically under French influence, its soul remained stitched from older cloth, Berber patterns, Ottoman arches, Roman ruins, and beneath it all, Phoenician bones. It was in this layered earth that Holmes believed the final cell of the Brotherhood had taken root. We were met by a pale Englishman in a pith helmet named Stratton, Mycroft's man in the consulate. He wore the stiff collar of a civil servant and carried a discreet revolver beneath his waistcoat. "They're expecting you," he murmured as he led us away from the quay and into the tangled arteries of the Medina. "The name Holmes casts a longer shadow than you'd like." Holmes raised a brow. "How so?" 3 local men were found strangled in the ruins of Carthage last week. All 3 were known informants. 2 of them had recently asked about a British gentleman traveling under the name Very. "That was my alias," Holmes said dryly. I assumed as much. As we pressed deeper into the city, the narrow lanes pressed back, stone walls sweating heat, wooden screens casting latticework shadows. It was not England, and yet the familiar presence of danger lingered all the same. That evening, under a blood-orange sky, Stratton took us to the outskirts of Carthage proper. What had once been the beating heart of Hannibal's empire was now a relic of pillars and wind, where jackals prowled after dusk and voices echoed too long. It was there that Holmes knelt beside a stone basin, dry, cracked, and covered in ancient carvings. "They've been meeting here," he said. "Not every night, only when the sky is right." Stratton frowned. "Astrology? No. Celestial camouflage." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Certain stars create distortions in the older lenses. The Phoenicians knew this. The Brotherhood, of course, appropriated their methods. I shivered. The basin looked more like an altar now, its edges stained too dark to name. The hair on my neck rose. Later, in the half-ruined villa we'd secured under French authority, Holmes laid out a sheaf of new documents. Letters, old records, and a curious hand-drawn map. One he claimed had been hidden in Quince's encoded journals, referenced obliquely as the vessel. The map showed 2 converging paths, one terrestrial, marked with ancient roadways and caravan routes, the other celestial, tracing the shadow of an eclipse set to pass over Tunisia in 6 days' time. "They plan something," he muttered, pacing. "Something during the moment of totality. They believe the eclipse is a gate, a veil between the visible and the hidden. To them, it's more than superstition. It's a calculated point of convergence. Convergence of what? Of time, of legitimacy, of lies becoming truth. I said nothing. Holmes was not prone to poetry unless danger swam just beneath its surface. The next day, we visited the Bardo Museum, where ancient artifacts from the Carthaginian and Roman eras had been unearthed, cleaned, and recontextualized. One particular piece stopped Holmes cold. A disc of black stone etched with a diagram that mirrored his eclipse path precisely. Beneath it was a Phoenician inscription. When the eye is swallowed, the heir shall fall, and the watcher shall rise. A prophecy? I asked. A forgery, Holmes replied, but a persuasive one, and one that justifies murder if followed by zealots. He turned. The Brotherhood sees itself as the watcher, but if they wish the heir to fall Edmund, they've failed. Unless they think he still must fall for the prophecy to come true. Precisely. Back at our villa, a new message awaited. It had been slipped under our door on rough paper, scrawled in hurried French. La clé est dans la crypte de Tanit, avant l'ombre. The key is in the crypt of Tanit, before the shadow. Holmes stared at it for a long time, then turned to Stratton. We need access to the Tanit site. Stratton blanched. You'll never get permission. It's under military protection. Some say it's cursed. Good, Holmes said. Then we'll go tonight. That night, with the moon a silver sickle and the heat heavy as a woolen shroud, we entered the ruins. The temple of Tanit was little more than a hollow cut into rock, scattered with offerings, broken urns, faded amulets, and bones too small for comfort. The crypt lay beneath a false altar. Stratton pried it open with a crowbar while Holmes muttered Phoenician under his breath. We descended by lantern light. The crypt was cramped and ancient, more cave than chamber, and at its far end stood a narrow niche, barely large enough for a man. Holmes stepped inside and ran his hand over the stone. His fingers found a small depression, and with a click, the wall beside him cracked open. Inside was a box, iron, rusted, sealed with wax. He opened it. Inside, a single parchment scroll, a medallion stamped with the symbol of the Brotherhood, and a wax-sealed letter. The scroll was a map, identical to Holmes's but more detailed. And the letter, he read it aloud. To the last watcher, at the hour of the eclipse, strike not at the heir, but at the gate, for the heir is but flesh, but the gate is eternal. Cleanse the lens, burn the truth, and the shadow shall become the law. We stood in silence. They mean to destroy the observatory, Holmes said at last. Not Edmund. They've realized they can't kill the heir without scandal. But if they destroy the records, the observatory itself, then the truth dies with it. And the will becomes legend, I said. A forgery sanctified by time. Exactly. He turned to us. We have 5 days. We must return to London, and we must stop them not with bullets, but with proof. Tangible, incontrovertible proof. As we left the crypt, the first winds of the desert stirred, hot and filled with dust. Behind us, something ancient sighed. And above, in the quiet clarity of the Tunisian sky, the stars wheeled, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned by the small, dangerous things their patterns inspired in men. Chapter 10. The Archive, Beneath Ashwood. We returned to London on the morning of the 3rd day before the eclipse. The Channel crossing had been cruel. Rain lashed our steamer from Boulogne, and by the time we reached the White Cliffs, my limbs ached with the damp of sleepless vigilance. Holmes, however, remained unaffected. His eyes, though red-rimmed from strain, gleamed with that glacial intensity I had come to recognize as the mark of his deepest focus. He had hardly spoken since Tunisia, save to murmur calculations beneath his breath. Astronomical tables, cross-referenced with registry archives and rail timetables. At Victoria Station, we were met not by a hansom cab, but by Mycroft Holmes. He stood, portly and unsmiling, beneath a black umbrella. A closed carriage waited behind him, unmarked save for its polished brass hinges. His tone was brisk. You've stirred quite the hornet's nest. We didn't stir it, Holmes replied. We merely uncovered its proper shape. I've received a dozen warnings from the Foreign Office, and 2 from the Church. Then it's worse than I thought, Holmes said, stepping into the carriage. I followed, still cradling the rusted scroll case from the Tanit crypt. Inside the carriage, Mycroft wasted no time. Quince's ledgers were only the surface. He was maintaining correspondence with a man named Orville Finch, a supposed philanthropist with a manor in Devonshire. The cipher matches Brotherhood code. We believe the original Darlington will, sealed, dated, and unamended, was hidden there before it was destroyed in London. But we confirmed the forgery, I said. Surely the courts? The courts accepted the best available version. If the original surfaces, with contradictory terms and the seal intact, everything changes. Mycroft turned to his brother. Are you prepared to break into Ashwood House? I'd prefer not to, Holmes murmured. But yes. Ashwood House lay in a grove of yew trees near Tottenham, a sprawl of cracked Georgian stone smothered by ivy and fog. The estate had once belonged to the Earls of Whittlesea, but had passed to Finch through a quiet transfer of titles in 1889, suspiciously close to the time of the supposed Darlington inheritance revision. Holmes and I arrived by midnight, armed with lanterns and cloaks. We left the carriage half a mile distant and approached on foot through mist-laden fields, our boots muffled in damp grass. The windows of the house were dark, though a faint glimmer flickered behind the heavy curtains of the east wing. No servants, Holmes whispered. He's working alone. We breached the manor through the conservatory, where glass panes groaned under the weight of moss and neglect. The house within was still, the air dense with dust and rot. Holmes paused in the entry hall, staring up at the portraits. Note the gaps, he murmured. I looked. Between ancestral visages in oil and varnish, there were indeed spaces where canvases had once hung. Only the faint ghost of their outlines remained on the wallpaper. Finch has removed the past, Holmes said, but not its foundations. He led us to the library, a cavernous chamber flanked by lead-bound volumes and a hearth cold with old soot. At the far wall, beside a toppled armillary sphere, Holmes found a small iron ring embedded in the floorboards. He pulled. A trapdoor creaked open. Beneath it, narrow stone steps spiraled into blackness. I do hate when the architecture proves so obliging, Holmes muttered. We descended by lamplight. The passage below was not a wine cellar as I expected, but a full subterranean archive, shelved with iron boxes, scrolls, crates, and folders bound in red silk. It smelled of mildew and ink, and time moved strangely there. Holmes rifled through several boxes before stopping short. He held up a bound packet of papers, yellowed but unburned. Darlington, original seal. No revision noted. He opened it with careful hands. There it was, the unaltered will. The heir, according to this document, was to be placed under guardianship until his 25th birthday, with no transfers of estate, no preemptive powers of sale, and no permission to override the Celestial Observatory's custodianship. This would have prevented everything, Holmes whispered. No access to the vaults, no power to sell or suppress. This would have preserved the truth. From the stairs above, a voice called down. I thought you might find that. We turned. Orville Finch stood at the threshold, lantern in one hand, pistol in the other. His features were gaunt, his eyes pale as dust. He was perhaps 60, with the leathery cast of a man long detached from consequence. I kept it safe, he said, because I knew it would matter to someone. The Brotherhood discarded it, but I'm a collector. I appreciate artifacts. Holmes stepped forward slowly. You intend to destroy it now. Finch shook his head. I've no such intent. Not anymore. The Brotherhood's fractured. You saw to that, but it doesn't mean I won't profit. Holmes's voice was cool. What's your price? Finch smiled. Oblivion. You walk away. The will disappears again. Forever. I live out my years in peace. Or you try to leave with it, and I shoot you both in the spine. For a moment, all was still. Then Holmes moved, but not as Finch expected. He threw the lamp. It shattered against the floor, dousing us in darkness, but not flame. Holmes had already doused the oil. I lunged left. Holmes tackled Finch in the chaos. The gun discharged once, the shot deafening in the confined space. Sparks struck stone. I struck Finch's hand with my cane, and the pistol skittered across the floor. Holmes had him in a moment, pinned and gasping. No more threats, Holmes said coldly. Only charges. By dawn, the will was in Mycroft's hands. Finch was detained under orders from the Home Secretary. And in London, Edmund Darlington prepared to enter the House of Lords, not as a figurehead, but as the man rightful by law and blood. That day, Holmes and I sat in silence beneath the windows of Baker Street. He smoked quietly. I read through the last clause of the will one final time, and to my son I leave not only estate and name, but the sacred guardianship of the observatory and its truths, which no man shall alter nor shadow obscure. Holmes tapped his pipe. "The stars do not lie," he said, "only the men who speak for them." Chapter 11. Totality. The sky was already darkening by noon. London, on the eve of a rare, total solar eclipse, buzzed with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Crowds swelled along the Thames, hawkers selling smoked glass lenses and handbills promising celestial prophecy. Children pointed at the heavens with sticky fingers, and gaslights flickered on though the sun had not yet vanished. But in the upstairs sitting room of 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere was somber, analytical, and tense. Holmes stood at the window with a telescope mounted atop a tripod, trained not at the stars, but at the Darlington Observatory far across the rooftops of Westminster. "It will begin at 3:12, he said, "at precisely the moment the moon devours the sun. If our enemies move, it will be then. They've always hidden beneath shadows. They won't resist one this perfect." He turned and looked directly at Edmund Darlington, seated at our table with a cup of untouched tea before him. The young man had changed. Since Tunisia and the discovery of the original will, he had grown sterner, less the fragile academic and more the nascent peer. Yet a flicker of uncertainty still danced behind his eyes. "Are you certain they'll try again?" Edmund asked. Holmes was unflinching. "I am. The will has been authenticated. Your claim is secure, but the observatory is more than brick and brass. It holds records, charts, papers, celestial data from your father's private calculations that directly contradict the altered timeline the Brotherhood concocted. You believe they'll destroy it? They must. To them, the eclipse is more than a symbol. It's a ritual deadline. They'll act now, or never." A knock came. Mrs. Hudson peeked in. "A gentleman for Mr. Holmes, a Colonel Greaves." "Show him in," Holmes said quickly. Colonel Greaves entered briskly, a square-jawed man in military coat and leather gloves with the unmistakable bearing of authority. He nodded once curtly. "Mycroft sent me," he said. "The guards we posted at the observatory have vanished." "Vanished?" I repeated. "Not relieved, not discharged. Gone." Holmes closed the telescope. "It's begun." We arrived at the Darlington Observatory by hansom cab. Holmes perched forward like a hawk, I with pistol loaded and coat collar up against the growing chill. Edmund followed behind in a second cab with Colonel Greaves, against Holmes's wishes. The sky above had dulled to a bruised gray, the eclipse's approach dimming the world in a strange and premature twilight. The light took on a coppery hue, trees cast double shadows, and birds fell quiet. The observatory loomed over the park at Hampstead Heath, its dome like a blind eye turned heavenward. All seemed quiet, but as we approached, Holmes held up a hand. "Step softly," he whispered. "Look, there." He pointed toward the eastern wall. A pane of glass had been removed, not shattered, but cleanly cut. The work of professionals. We entered through the staff door and climbed the winding staircase to the main gallery. The great telescope stood still, unmoving. But beside it, "Dear God," I said. One of the guards, Ordnance Officer Little, lay sprawled on the floor, his uniform bloodied and torn. Holmes knelt beside him. "Alive," he murmured. "Unconscious, not killed. A warning." He stood and pointed to the archives room beyond the gallery. The door was ajar. We pushed inside. The Brotherhood had returned. 3 men in dark coats stood amidst shelves of astronomical scrolls and ledgers, each armed, each masked by soot-black cloth. One held a bundle of records soaked in kerosene. Holmes stepped forward without fear. "Drop the match," he said. "You've lost." One of them, a tall figure with a faint Scottish accent, turned. "It's not about winning," he said. "It's about erasure. You've no time. The eclipse is minutes away. If the fire rises now, the whole dome will collapse before you leave." "We're not leaving," Holmes advanced. "I've faced zealots before. This isn't prophecy. It's cowardice dressed in parchment." Suddenly a cry came from behind us. Edmund had entered. The second man turned and grabbed him. "No!" I shouted. But Holmes didn't hesitate. He threw something from his pocket. A small vial. Smoke exploded in a thick white plume. I lunged forward, swinging my cane toward the attacker's wrist. The match fell unlit, and Edmund slipped from his grip. Holmes tackled the last of them to the floor. Within seconds, Greaves and his men stormed in. The Brotherhood operatives were subdued, their tools confiscated, their arms bound. Holmes stood breathless. The clock struck 3:12. Outside, cheers erupted. We all turned to the observatory's great viewing window. The eclipse had reached totality. The sun vanished behind the moon, casting a halo of unearthly light over London. The air cooled, the world hushed, and for a moment it felt as though we stood not in a city of soot and politics, but on the edge of something ancient. Beside me, Edmund whispered, "My father always said truth was in the light." Holmes replied, "And yet it's shadow that reveals what's hidden." That evening, as the last tendrils of sunlight returned and the great crowds dispersed, Holmes and I sat in the gallery of the observatory. The Brotherhood cell had been arrested, their plot foiled. The original will had been deposited with the Crown's solicitor. Edmund would soon ascend not only to his rightful title, but to public attention as a patron of scientific truth. And Holmes? Well, Holmes had returned to his usual silence. He smoked and thought and watched the stars. At last I asked, "Was it truly ever about Edmund?" "No," Holmes said. "It was about the archive, the records, the idea that something as intangible as starlight could unravel an empire of lies. They feared that more than bullets." He stood and tapped the telescope gently. "Stars can't be forged. They are what they are, timeless, unchanging. But what we do with their light, that's where the danger lies." I closed my notebook. Outside, the sky cleared, and above us, for the first time in days, every star blazed anew. Chapter 12, The Sextant of Secrets. I awoke the next morning to a house already in motion. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled, his hands stained with soot and ink. Spread before him were the star charts recovered from the Darlington Observatory, a latticework of dates, alignments, and arcane annotations. The eclipse was over, but in Holmes's mind, the true alignment had only just begun. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do you recall the brass sextant in the observatory's vestibule?" I blinked away sleep. "The one mounted in the floor?" "Yes, it was ornamental, I thought. A museum piece." "Not merely ornamental." He tapped a circle on the chart before him. "It was forged in 1745. The engraving along the inner dial contains a calibration system that was considered archaic even by Georgian standards. The device wasn't meant to track celestial bodies for navigation. It was meant to measure anomalies, deviations in the expected order of things." I leaned in. "Like a celestial event? Like a false eclipse?" I stared at him. "But the eclipse was real." "Indeed," Holmes said, finally raising his eyes. "But the Brotherhood's final goal may not have been destruction. It may have been revelation. And they may have failed." He stood and paced the room, pausing only to retrieve a letter from the sideboard. "This was delivered while you slept," he said. "From Edmund." I read it quickly. "Mr. Holmes, a man is dead. One of the Brotherhood. His name was Jonathan Paris. He was found this morning at the foot of the observatory tower." No note. No struggle. But in his coat was a page torn from my father's final logbook. It mentions a mirror of ascension and coordinates that do not correspond to any known terrestrial location. I fear whatever this Brotherhood pursued is not yet concluded. Please come. E.D. Holmes waited while I digested it. Then he simply said, "Get your coat." Ashen fog hung low over Hampstead Heath as we arrived. The observatory had been cordoned off again, not a new perimeter of constables posted at every gate. Edmund greeted us at the entrance, face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought it was over," he said. "It may be," Holmes answered, "but that depends on what was left behind." He led us not to the archives nor to the great telescope, but to the base of the observatory's tower, an unused spire long locked since Lord Darlington's death. A constable there nodded gravely. "We found the body here, sir. Neck broken, fell from the upper hatch." Holmes ascended first, pausing only to study the iron lock, now twisted out of shape. "Forced recently," he murmured. "And not professionally. Desperate, perhaps." We climbed behind him, stair after stair through the hollow tower until we reached the dome, a round chamber lined in aged mahogany, with narrow windows and a central plinth. Upon it, half shrouded in a dusty tarp, stood the sextant I had seen before. Holmes removed the cover. The device gleamed as if newly polished. The brass arcs shone beneath a patina of time, but it was the etching along the inner curve that drew Holmes's attention. He traced the inscription with gloved fingers. "Latin," he said. "Ubicumque umbra cadit, ibi veritas latet." I translated aloud. "Wherever the shadow falls, there lies the truth." Holmes turned a lever, and the sextant clicked into motion. Not to the sky, but downward. A mirror below the lens caught the faint light from the window and reflected it against the far wall, where a series of concentric rings had been carved into the stone, hidden until now. "Not a navigational instrument," Holmes whispered. "A key." I stepped forward. "But a key to what?" Edmund, still near the stairs, answered. "My father's final project. He believed there were correspondences between celestial events and electromagnetic patterns in the Earth. Ley lines, as some call them. He theorized that certain astronomical alignments could be used not just to observe, but to access information stored in the very structure of the world, as if the Earth itself remembered." Holmes gave him a curious look. "Your father was not merely an astronomer, Mr. Darlington. He was a metaphysician." A strange silence settled over the room. I looked again at the mirrored light, now forming a triangle with the arcs carved into the wall. "What are we looking at?" I asked. Holmes knelt. "A celestial map, or a burial." He pressed against the wall where the light converged. There was a soft click, and a portion of the wall swung open. Behind it, a narrow niche, no wider than a book. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with waxed cord, was a journal. Holmes pulled it free and opened it. We gathered round. The pages were filled with formulas, star charts, and annotations that grew progressively erratic, but one passage near the center stood out, written in darker ink, as if rewritten over faded original script. "They think the eclipse erases, but it reveals. Beneath the shadow is not silence but pattern, and in the pattern, prophecy. The heir is not the final piece, he is the beginning of a cycle." I looked at Holmes. "Do you think he lost his mind?" "No," he said. "I think he discovered something so immense that it shattered the framework of reason. Lord Darlington didn't die by accident. I believe he was silenced. And I believe Paris, the Brotherhood man, saw this journal last night and realized the truth." He closed the book, which is why he threw himself from the tower. We returned to Baker Street that evening, the journal secure in Holmes's files. I watched as he cataloged it, not just as evidence, but as an artifact, a piece of human history tied to the stars above and the soil below. For once, he did not try to explain away the inexplicable. He merely respected it. "So," I asked, pouring us each a brandy, "what now?" Holmes looked out the window at the first stars rising above the rooftops. "Now we wait. Truth, like starlight, takes time to arrive. But when it does, it cannot be stopped." He raised his glass. "To the heir." I raised mine. "To the shadow that revealed the truth." We drank, and outside, above the sleeping city, the stars continued to burn, ancient, indifferent, and eternal. Chapter 13. The Eclipse Ascendant. The days that followed passed with the heavy weight of inevitability. London, still hushed beneath a canopy of waning light and autumn chill, seemed to hold its breath, as though even the city itself awaited the final revelation. Holmes and I had returned to Baker Street, where the journal from the observatory lay open on the cluttered desk. Its pages, part scientific treatise, part esoteric prophecy, hinted at a cosmic design beyond ordinary comprehension. The Brotherhood's zeal, the forged wills, the celestial instruments, the death of Lord Darlington, and the disappearance of his son all coalesced into a pattern more complex than any mere earthly ambition. Holmes paced the room, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The heir was never the intended final custodian, he mused. He was the key to awakening something, an ancient cycle encoded in the heavens and bound to the Earth's secret veins. I sighed. And all because of a rare eclipse. Because of the eclipse, Watson. The Brotherhood sought to bury the truth in darkness, but in doing so, they illuminated it. The final piece fell into place on the evening of the next new moon, when Edmund summoned Holmes and me once again to Ashwood House. The estate had changed, no longer the decaying relic of a shadowed lineage, but a place alive with cautious hope. The observatory stood restored, its great dome polished and gleaming under a moonless sky. "Thank you for everything," Edmund said gravely. "But I fear one final test remains. The journal speaks of a hidden chamber beneath the observatory, an ancient vault containing the Eclipse Ascendant, a mechanism designed to reveal truth through light and shadow." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we must find it before the Brotherhood does." Together, we descended into the archives beneath the observatory, retracing the steps that had first led us to the will. The air was thick with anticipation and dust. Holmes studied the sextant again, then placed it carefully in a notch on the wall. A series of clicks echoed and stone slabs shifted, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into utter darkness. Holmes produced a candle and led the way. The stair spiraled downward, ending in a vast chamber lit by faint phosphorescence from veins of mineral embedded in the walls. At the center stood a strange contraption, a vast brass and glass apparatus resembling a mechanical orrery, but with mirrors and lenses positioned to channel light from above. Holmes examined the controls, dials marked with astrological symbols, and inscriptions in Latin, veritas per umbram lumenque, truth through shadow and light. With deliberate care, Holmes adjusted the dials to match the coordinates and timing recorded in the journal. As he turned the final lever, a beam of moonlight from a small aperture above was captured and refracted through the mirrors, and projecting an intricate celestial map onto the chamber walls. Suddenly, hidden compartments slid open, revealing stacks of documents, records, correspondences, even a ledger of Brotherhood activities spanning decades. Holmes sifted through them. "Here," he said, voice taut with satisfaction. "Proof of every forgery, every conspiracy. Names, dates, locations. The Brotherhood sought to erase the Heir and rewrite history, but here lies their undoing." Edmund approached, eyes wide. "And my family's honor restored." Holmes smiled faintly. "More than restored, illuminated." Weeks later, with the Brotherhood disbanded and the original will upheld in full, Edmund took his place in the House of Lords. The Darlington Observatory became a beacon of scientific inquiry and historical preservation. Holmes and I resumed our quiet routine at Baker Street, though the shadow of the eclipse and its revelations lingered in our thoughts. One evening, as I closed my journal, Holmes remarked quietly, "The stars are ancient watchers, Watson. Plus, they bear witness not only to what is, but to what we choose to see, and sometimes to what we choose to hide." I nodded. "And sometimes the greatest mysteries lie not in the stars, but in the shadows they cast." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Until the next case, my dear Watson." As always, I was ready. Epilogue. Light beyond the shadow. Several months had passed since the eclipse that had reshaped the lives of Edmund Darlington and the fate of his family. London had settled back into its ceaseless rhythm, horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones, gas lamps flickering on fog-laden streets, and the ceaseless hum of city life. Yet, for those of us who had stood at the edge of the celestial mystery, the world felt subtly altered. The Darlington Observatory had become a place of pilgrimage for scholars and skeptics alike, a symbol of truth forged through shadow. Edmund himself, now seated in the House of Lords, carried a quiet dignity, tempered by the weight of his family's legacy. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes remained as ever, immersed in his studies, his mind never resting. Yet, there was a softness now in his gaze when he spoke of stars, as if he too had glimpsed something beyond mere logic. One evening, as I sat by the fire, penning notes of the case, Holmes approached with a rare smile. "Watson," he said, "the eclipse reminded me that even the darkest moments can reveal a hidden light. We chase shadows to find truth, yet sometimes the shadows are cast by truths we fear to face." I looked up, meeting his steady eyes, and yet the light always returns. He nodded. "Indeed, and until it does, we remain vigilant." Outside, the night sky stretched vast and infinite, stars glittering like distant promises. In their glow, I found reassurance, not only that the universe holds its secrets, but that there are those who will seek them out, no matter the darkness. And so the story ends, not with finality, but with a quiet hope. For in every eclipse, every shadow, there is a light waiting to be discovered. Thank you so much for listening to our Honoring Audiobooks original Sherlock Holmes adventure. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment, letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.